It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the next hour, Sarah Laskow. So Sarah is a reporter, writer, editor who is currently a senior science editor at The Atlantic. In her own writing, she has published in a variety of venues. I had to write down some notes because I was not going to remember all of the ones I wanted to mention. And these are just the ones I chose to mention. So of course, there's many more. But her work has appeared in the New York Times, on NPR's All Things Considered, the New Republic, the Boston Globe, the Smithsonian, Atlas Obscura, and many other things. And she's written on a really wide variety of topics, many of them related to science and history, but also things that expand sort of at the edges of that. So this includes things like evolution and climate change. She's written about the hidden memories of plants. She's written about a medieval diet, which she not only researched and wrote about, but actually followed for a week. And so that was a really fun article to read.
They're really my greatest hits. Yeah.
She's written 2 children's books, and I'm going to share their titles because they are so delightful that all of you with and without kids are going to rush out and buy these books. So there's the very short, entirely true history of unicorns, and the very short, entirely true history of mermaids. And part of the reason I share this with you is because part of what really drew me to Sarah's work and to her writing and motivated me to ask her to come talk to us here is because I think her own writing really combines clarity and informativeness and really great research with playfulness and being fun and being really enjoyable to read. And I think that's such an amazing combination to accomplish together. So I hope you will join me in welcoming her. And I do want to let you all know that following this hour-long event in here, we will have a reception that you're all welcome to join us for, which will be just outside the doors here. And I'll remind you of that at the end. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Hello. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I sound really impressive. Who knew? I'm an editor at The Atlantic, and since it's a national publication for general readers, a lot of what I spend my time thinking about is how to get people's attention. So, as you guys know, nowadays a lot of people are in that same business. And I confess that one thing that got my attention recently was this Instagram reel about a Connecticut hedge fund wife who wanted to be an exorcist. So I did send this to my group chat, but I would say this actually didn't do a great job of what I tried to do because I didn't actually click on this. I didn't watch it. I didn't engage with it. And what my job is to think about how to get people's attention and then keep it. And as readers, I know you guys read, I assume, the newspaper or magazines, maybe still, hopefully. You kind of see the end result of that. The first thing you look at is a headline, right? Here's one that we published recently, Is It Aging or ADHD? So that's the first thing we showed you to try and get your attention. And then we have the first paragraph of the story. This is something we think so much about. In this first, 100 words or so, this is our bid for a reader to stay with us. And we really, really, really hope that people keep reading after this first paragraph. We do a lot of work to make sure that people do. But the reality is that a lot of people do not. One metric that we and many other publications look at is how long people stay reading a story and what percentage of readers spend any significant time with it. For us, that's how many people keep reading after spending 30 seconds on a story. And our standard is that we want 50% of readers to stick with a story longer than that. But that means that half of people don't after just 30 seconds. So imagine if 50% of you had already left this room. That's what's happening on most stories that you read online or in the newspaper or in a magazine. And that's true for even really popular, successful stories. So we see maybe 20% of people will start reading a story and decide it's not worth their time. And that's a huge success story, So like I'm saying, a big part of my job is trying to figure out from the very early stages of each piece, what makes a good story? What makes a story that is gonna I'm going to be able to write a good headline for that's going to catch people's attention from the very beginning, and then that people are going to stick with it. And so what I'm asking to try and start answering that question is, why should we publish this story? Why is it valuable to our readers? And the reason I think about those questions, as opposed to like, well, is this an interesting story, is that there are so many interesting things in the world. Like, I'm sure I could call on each of you and you would tell me about something like totally fascinating that you knew so much about, that you've been thinking about for like months or years at this point, and you could talk about for 50 minutes or longer, and it would be like totally fascinating. But we don't have time for that right now. Like, people out there in the world like also don't have time to learn about every single thing. So this sort of work of understanding why people might want to spend time with a particular story, beyond that it's fascinating to you, the writer or the podcaster or the person who did the research, answering that question can go a long way towards actually getting people's attention. So today I'm going to talk about a few ways I think about answering that question for stories that feature science in particular. And hopefully that can help you guys think about how, if you're interested in writing for a popular audience or talking to a popular audience, you can get into people's heads in the same way. So one thing that makes people read stories, they want to be surprised. This is kind of how I first got into science journalism. Like, it's kind of the most basic idea in science writing. Science is discovering new ideas all the time. When you have that kind of information and only you have it, I think that's like can be like a very special feeling. It's something that I think you get as a scientist, or a researcher. I think it's something you get as a journalist too. Just like knowing you know something that no one else does is like one of the most incredible feelings in the world. But that doesn't necessarily, just because it's new, doesn't necessarily answer this question that we're talking about. Why should someone pay attention to that idea? And to start answering that question, one of the first things we ask is, okay, how new is this? And again, like on a basic level, any piece of research, any new idea, like on a fundamental level is new. But when we say how new is it, we're not just asking like, is this something that no one has ever talked about before, or no one has ever talked about before publicly? We're asking, okay, like, well, what will surprise people about it? What will feel new about it? And that's kind of a key distinction. One thing that I ask myself when I'm thinking about this is, okay, what surprised me about it? And what might surprise a normal person about this? And the answer is not always the same. Just for example, I was talking to a writer who I work with on and off about a pitch about solar geoengineering. I don't know how much you guys think about I think about that like a medium amount. And so he was saying like he had been talking to this company, like a pretty big company in this world, and they were going to be releasing a new study about sort of explaining the technology behind their product, and also releasing like their theory of the safety around it. And I was like, oh, well, that's surprising to me. Like, I know a lot about this compared to a normal person. And I know that it's like new for them. Well, to be fair, I had to look up to check, like it's new that they actually would be explaining like how this technology worked. And it's kind of a new thing for like a geoengineering company to have like a safety manifesto. Like we've seen that from AI companies and some other companies in the past. Like one of the ones he was talking about was Palantir. But it's like kind of new in geoengineering. So I was like, okay, like this is interesting. But then I was like, would this be surprising to a normal person? And I was like, maybe not. Like I feel like a normal person might not even know like that solar geoengineering had like gotten this far along. And so we sort of had to like keep talking about it besides just like the basic facts of what was new to figure out what the story might be for a general audience. I did end up assigning the story, so I'm not going to talk more about it because the information is not public yet. But those are kind of like the basic things that we think about when we're talking about new. And like just as an example of how this ends up looking in the popular press, like, this was like a recent story in the New York Times. I feel like there's like some really clear things in this that answer the questions, okay, what's new? Like in the lead, Carl Zimmer writes about how there were 2 new studies and they converged on this like new idea, like where did eyes come from? At the beginning, there were not 2, but there was just 1, exactly how it says in the headline. And so like, I don't know, I think that's surprising. Like, I don't know how much you guys have ever thought about eyes. Like, people are nodding. Like, this is good. But like, if you had thought about it, you may be like, yeah, maybe there was 1, maybe there's 2. You probably would have like a passing thought about it. But like, now you know this. It's kind of like a nice fact. It's like something that you might surprise someone with at a cocktail party or something like that. So that's like a nice, news story about a new study that kind of clears that bar for like something that's new and something that's surprising and something that people might be interested in. Like, we all have eyes. Everyone's kind of interested in where our eyes come from, I guess. But I think the bar for new is actually quite high in the news media. Like, we look at news all the time. There's like a lot of new information coming out all the time. So actually, just for something to be new, and even something to be like surprising on its own, like doesn't necessarily mean someone will like want to publish something about your research. Another like pitch example, someone pitched me a story recently that was related to some very new research. It was going to be published in a great journal. And the first question like me and my fellow editor wanted to know was just not just whether like the actual research in the study said something new, which it did, but if it would like change our whole understanding of the relevant debate. Like sometimes you can do like really cool incremental research that adds new information to a debate without fundamentally changing it. And so like I think a lot of times in the public like press, what we're thinking about is like, is this going to change people's understanding? And so the second question we think about when we're thinking about like why should people pay attention is how big is the idea? And I think a good rule of thumb to think about here is that often like big is more important than new. I think like that's something that I, even as a journalist, have like learned over time. You can have a new idea and it can be too small to be interesting. And you can have a big idea, and if it's big enough, it doesn't have to be so new. So just to give an example of this from our site, this is one we published recently. It's by Adam Frank. He's an astrophysicist. Oh, someone else is nodding. Yeah, at the University of Rochester. He's also like a pretty prolific, popular writer. I'm not really an expert on physics at all. Like, it's not even something that I cover all that much. But I don't think that what he's writing here, which is basically physicists are coming to this idea that they should think more about biological systems. I'm just guessing that like if I asked a physicist about this, they'd be like, oh yeah, that's not new. And he's not writing here about a particular discovery or a particular breakthrough, but what he's managed to do in this story is like identify this big idea that's percolating in his world, but that most people probably aren't aware of. So I think this is a good example of like, it's like new to the public, even if it's not new to the experts, but it's big enough that it can still catch people's attention. Here's a couple of other examples that I've just remembered from other publications. This Scientific American story came out, like 2 years ago, or in 2024. I thought this was a great story, and it does have an answer to the question, like, how new is this? Like, if you look at the deck, which is like, I don't know, that's like the line under the headline, we call it the deck. So it's saying like, a new telescope is gonna like do some research, and there is like a new element here. A new telescope is going to like answer this question in a way it might not before. But at the same time, like when you read the story, it's mostly about like just the possibility of a Planet 9 at all. And again, like I don't think that in 2024 was news to like most scientists who studied the solar system or any scientists who studied the solar system. But like the idea that like there's a Planet 9 that's not Pluto, I think to a lot of general readers probably was like new totally. Like, I think about space probably more than like 99% of people in America, and like I hadn't really clocked that. So I think like one thing to think about is like, you can't really underestimate like how little people know in some ways. Like, you know, like if you think like, I think about myself, you think about yourself, like we're all like very smart people, I assume, and we know a lot about a lot of things, but then we also know nothing about most things. So like, in some ways, when you're thinking about like, what is like big and new about my idea, you should like imagine that you're talking to a really smart person who probably actually knows like very little about the thing that you know most about. And that there's like a lot of potential to surprise them with even like something that might seem obvious at this point to you because you've like learned it a little while ago and talked to your friends and colleagues about it extensively. But like that thing, that like core thing that's exciting to you, like even if it feels at this point like a little bit like, oh yeah, we've been over that, like to most of the people you'll meet in the world, like they've never heard of it, and so it's new to them. The other example I was thinking out here, this one's from quite a while ago, The Uninhabitable Earth. This was like a big story in New York Magazine about climate change. It was published in 2017. And you know, I cover climate change, and I remember reading it at the time and thinking like it didn't really have anything new in it, but it did make this like really big claim, which like was very clever in a way. And like when you read the story, the kind of crux thesis is, no matter how well informed you are, I'm quoting from the story right now, you are surely not alarmed enough. So this is kind of like telling the reader, like, you think you know this story, but actually you don't. Like in some ways he was like really hand-holding the reader into saying like, you think this isn't new, but like, or the way you're thinking about this isn't big enough, basically. I think it's still possible to argue about whether the theory of the case is true or not about climate change. Like, the story made a lot of big claims about like how bad things were gonna be. But it did do a good job of surprising readers, even on a topic where people often feel like they know what's up, like climate change. People are like, I get it. And so I think that's one reason why it did go so big in its claim, because it was like doing this job in the writing of really like shaking people out of their complacency about it. And the other thing that I thought was really like good about this story, and again just speaks to like how the question to answer can be like, how big of an idea is it? This story did a great job of being like, read this one story about climate change, and then you do not have to read about climate change again for like quite a while. And I think that's like often what readers are looking for, is kind of like, yeah, I want to learn about something, I want to be smart about something, and then I want to like not have to think about it again, to just feel like I have like mastered in a kind of general way that little corner of the universe. I can talk about it in an intelligent way to my friends, or like in conversation as it comes up, and that's really all I need. So that's kind of category one, I would say, for why like readers might come to your stories. And that's, I think like, if you're trying to pitch a story or talk to people about like some scientific work, kind of like in a vacuum, like that's the first question I would ask. So mode 2, why else do people want to read about science? I would say they want help. And a lot of my job is in this realm, writing about science in a way that can help people understand the pressing issues they're already thinking about. So like category 1, we're talking about getting people's attention for something they didn't even know they wanted to think about. Category 2, someone's thinking about this a lot, and they want help understanding it, and science has answers for them. So from my experience, COVID was like one of the biggest stories, just like such a clear example of how this could work. This was actually the first story I ever worked on about COVID, and I worked on many stories about COVID. But this one I think was interesting. It was about something like really basic and really nerdy, or not, which, yeah. oops. Oh, I thought I put the paragraph in it. But so R naught, as we wrote in the story, is just the average number of people who will catch a disease from a single infected person in a population that's never seen the disease before. It's like in epidemiology, it's a pretty basic concept. It's interesting. In theory, you could write an interesting story about that like anytime, but normally you would not, because getting someone to read about the average number of people who will catch disease from a single infected person in a population that's never seen the disease before, I mean, that would be pretty hard. I think like on a given day, like you guys probably would not choose to read a story about this. But in January 2020, this was something that people were talking about and thinking about, and people had this really vested interest in understanding how a virus moves through the population with no immunity. This story helped answer a question that people already had and added understanding to the world that people felt like they needed. This was another early coronavirus story. This was in February 2020. This was like before things really started getting weird. Like I edited this in the office. It was about 2.5 weeks before Trump declared a national emergency. And I think this story, again, like just answered a question and helped explain the reality of what a lot of people were wondering at that time, or maybe not even yet, but like it just, am I gonna get COVID? And this story had like a really early, clear answer to that question, which was yes, like you are, eventually. I think that ended up being really correct, and it's good that we had such a clear headline. The story itself didn't actually do a great job of explaining why this was true up front. Like, if you go back and look at this story, there's like 600 words of like, I don't even know what. And then in the second section, we quote this Harvard epidemiologist who said, like very clearly, I think it's likely that this virus is not going to be containable. I think if I were editing the story now, I would probably make that the first paragraph. Like I was saying before, like that's, you know, people are going to click away. People are not going to pay attention to it. But I mean, at the time, like the interest in this topic was so high. Like I don't like have the numbers or anything, but I remember that like a ton of people read this story. A ton of people read the whole story. Like people read this because they wanted the answer to this question, even though in some ways we didn't do the best job of answering it so clearly. Anyway, like me, you guys lived through COVID. We can fast forward. This is the key paragraph. This was another one that we did in that period. If you look again at the date here, like this was a story we did in November 2020. It was basically when like the first vaccine rules came out. I think that this one, you know, it was right. It was also wrong. It was based on those like really early results, which found that the vaccines were 90% effective. And if you guys recall, they were going to approve the vaccines if they were even 50% effective. So I think like what we were trying to do with this story was help people, you know, with like understanding the science of the vaccines and the early vaccines results, like understand like, okay, like we've all been through this like crazy year, like where are we? And the sort of message we were trying to give was we've made it to like a really important benchmark. Like we have vaccines, they work really well. Something's about to change. I don't know if it was true that the end of the pandemic was in sight, but I do think that like this story did capture something that was true at the time and was like our best understanding of the scientific reality at the time, which is that the vaccines worked well, it made a huge difference in how many people were dying. The fact that we had gotten them so quickly, as the story documents, was a scientific landmark. And that was all true at the time, even if it wasn't like a complete understanding of what happened or what was going to happen. I do think that's one fun thing about journalism, which is like, you know, as things change. You keep writing about it. You keep updating your hypothesis. You keep writing about like what is new. And again, like the rules that I was talking about before about like how new does something have to be interesting? It does depend a lot about the context matters a lot, because in like a environment like this, like something doesn't have to be that new to still be interesting. Just as kind of a point, like this same writer, Sarah Zhang, like later wrote a story about Omicron. So, we updated our thesis about the end of the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, COVID was like an extreme time, right? Like there's not often a national story that's like so clearly based in like science and has relevance to science that like everyone in the whole world is thinking about, and that's one of like the top 3 things they're interested in. But I think that like this same principle applies like in general, like if you can like notice what people are already interested in, that's a really important, and like figure out how you can help them better understand a thing they're already thinking about, like that's a really good way to get people to think about what you're thinking about. Like you kind of like use their existing interest as a hook, and then you kind of shift their view to what you want them to think about. Here's an example kind of on the other end of the news spectrum. This was a story we did last year. This was a story that came out basically the day after the news of the discovery of a new color. I don't know if you guys followed this, but basically, and I'm gonna get this a little bit wrong, but there were some scientists in Berkeley, and they did something that I don't quite remember, and they created like this mechanism to make the human eye experience a color that it had never experienced in the history of humanity. But to do it, it was like 3 people got to see it. And so this story that we did was like a day after the news story, because we thought like, oh, people are like really interested in this new color. The idea of a new color is like fascinating. People are gonna be interested in this for like 24 hours, like beyond just knowing that it happened at all. And so my colleague Ross like called up the scientists and did the story that was more on like the human perspective. He talked to them about like what was it actually like to see the new color or not. Like the guy who actually, I think, one of the guys who like discovered it didn't get to see it. And I think that like this story, the idea was that it answered a question that people might have wondered about in passing, like what would it be like to see a new color once you knew it existed? And the kind of big principle here is like when you're thinking about people's attention and catching people's attention, is to think about like where is their attention already, and like how long will that attention last? One thing that we talk about a lot is catching the wave of the news. So every time there is like a public moment of attention on a topic that you know about, that's an opportunity to make a point or forward an argument that you want people to know about anyway, like I was saying. But you do usually have to act pretty quickly. I think one thing that people outside of newsrooms might not totally understand is like exactly how small a window for catching this wave can be. Like I get pitches for pieces that are related to news that happened yesterday, and sometimes that's already like way too late. Unless it is a big news event, pitching a piece like 2 or 3 days after the news happened, often that's like late in the news cycle. Part of that's because of the lag time of publishing a piece. Like once you pitch something, a publication has to decide to do the story. You have to write it. The editor has to edit it. Most pieces go through 2 rounds of edits. In my experience, not just at The Atlantic is honestly like pretty slow these days compared to like how we were in the past. Not for everything, but the minimum time it can take from like an assignment to a publication is probably like 4 hours. Like a long time ago when I was freelancing, I remember like I covered Superstorm Sandy, and I think like I got assigned a piece in the morning, I like called some people, I wrote, I filed in like an hour or two, my editor edited it, it got published. All of that's still like 4 hours. And like most of the time it takes a lot more time. Like I just worked on a story about the collision that happened at LaGuardia. I assigned that story on Monday afternoon, and we published it this morning at like 10 a.m. And like that I felt like was too slow, you know, like I wish I had published that story yesterday, because I think like yesterday people were still interested in that crash. Today people are medium interested in it, but like maybe they've read one article about it already, and that's like their one article. So the window can be really, really short. And so, you know, like if you are interested in writing for a popular publication, I would say like the best time and way to pitch a piece, if you're offering an expert perspective, it's probably to send a paragraph that's outlining your idea and the main point you'd want to make in the first couple of hours after a news event. If it's possible, like pitching before the news even happens is also like really great. You know, like if, I don't know, like another piece of news that we're covering this week is the nomination of the CDC director. In fact, I think they're probably not going to nominate one, which is interesting. But like if you wanted to write a piece about the CDC this week, like having sent an idea for it last week would have been great. Like sending it today when they already have like made this announcement or the news is coming out that like the nomination isn't happening, like that's like, you know, by the time you would publish the piece, it would be the weekend. That could still work. Sometimes like different publications have different thinking about that, but sometimes people run analysis pieces on the weekends. But like if the piece is like gonna run next week, like that's already late. Okay, so that was my kind of practical advice about pitching. So, and I think a lot of the times, if you are like pitching in this kind of zone where you're like right in the news or before the news, then you kind of put yourself in the running for being like what we call second day stories. And those tend to be the ones that are intended not just to tell people what happened, but like how to understand and think about it. And if you're not an actual reporter, that's like the most likely space you're gonna occupy, you know, in like a second or third day story when people already know what's happened, but they're still kind of wanting to know how they should think about it, like how they should process this into their lives. And sometimes people are gonna be like really open to your point of view on whatever that is. Other times people come to a topic or a story with their own opinions. They might know there are competing ways to think about a particular question. And in that case, there's kind of like a third reason why people might, or a third question you might think about for why people would pay attention to what you have to say. And that's that they want to be convinced, or at least they're open to it. I think this is one that has become more relevant to me in the Trump administration. You know, I think there's a lot of writing about science that the goal of it is to bring readers around to the scientific point of view. This is hard. I think it's one of the hardest, this is kind of the hardest mode of the three that I'm talking about. But it can be really powerful. Okay, so some recent news that I've been thinking about in this mode is aliens. I don't know if you guys saw, but the government registered the aliens.gov domain. So in theory, we're gonna get some news about aliens sometime soon. And this is actually like a tricky topic because it's a case where people are not necessarily interested in like scientific reality. They don't have like an open question about, you know, what does science have to say about this? They probably want to know about like, you know, what's in area 52 or whatever, 51. But I think there's still room for expertise in this moment. This is a story we published. This one wasn't news pegged, but it's another piece by Adam Frank. This is a type of piece that I think you could do in a contested type of news moment. You know, the government releases a bunch of documents about alien life. In some ways, the question that people are asking is, are aliens real? And a story like this that like describes the reality of the search for alien life, I think is a moment where you could try and bring an audience over to like the real object of scientific fascination and convince them that that's actually like the more important thing. Another topic I think a lot about is vaccines. And that's, you know, in the past few years, mainstream scientific opinions have lost a lot of power in the government, with some parts of the public. Most of the people who read The Atlantic are pretty convinced that vaccines are a public good, but we still think a lot about how writing about the science of vaccination might shift people's opinions. And I think this is like a way in which like you can see that the modes of writing can really like be expansive. These are 3 examples of stories that we ran lately. Katie Wu's story, The Death Doctors Never Thought They'd See in the US, it walks through like the statistical realities of measles and how the number of cases we're seeing likely portends some of the worst outcomes that can happen with the disease just on like a pure numbers level. This story that Liz Brunig did, How a Child Dies of Measles, that one was based in reporting. She talked to a lot of doctors about just like what measles look like, what the course of measles can look like, what does it actually look like when you die of measles, what are the different ways that can happen. And then she like knit that into a piece where she imagined a family, not based on any one particular family that she talked to or anything, but just like thinking about like, well, what would this look like in a future where this becomes more and more common? And then Tom Bartlett's story was kind of a profile of Del Bigtree. He's a really prominent anti-vaccine activist based in Texas. He's like a pretty important person in RFK Jr.'s world. And that story like much more directly engaged with the argument that anti-vaccine activists make. He really like sat down with Del and talked to him about like, well, what is Del's argument? Why doesn't he buy the argument that like Tom would make about why vaccines actually work and aren't harming people? And I think like, you know, it's certainly true that not all of these stories will convince every reader. Maybe they didn't convince any readers. That's really hard to know. You know, that this job, like the convincing people job, is harder than surprising them or helping them with the information they want. But I think one thing that's interesting to think about is like each of these stories has a different theory for why someone might read it. You know, Katie's might appeal to someone who wants to understand the bigger picture behind the news. Liz's might appeal to someone who just wants to read an emotionally charged story. I mean, I like cried at the end of reading that story. And Tom's might appeal to somebody who really wants to understand the arguments on both sides of the debate. So they each have like a different theory of the case for like what might be convincing to people. I do think this can be like a really powerful mode of writing and a way that science and talking about science to a popular audience can be like a really powerful tool. It's really hard to pull off, and like I said, it's hard to know if it works. I think there's a interesting, I think, newish podcast kind of in this mode called Why Should I Trust You? I don't know if anyone here listens to that, but it's like really, yes, someone does. It's really, do you work on that podcast? No. Oh yeah, just a fan. But it's like right in that mode of trying to figure out, okay, well, what does convince people? How much of all of this that I'm talking about is AI going to be able to do? And the short answer is some of it, right? Like, I was looking at that story about R naught. That's essentially an explainer. And that's the type of story that publishers think might become less valuable. This is from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They asked publishers how they might refocus content in the era of AI. And you can see like right at the bottom is service journalism. Service journalism, like some of that is like, you know, I don't know. Like I feel like the most classic example that is also clickbait is the Huffington Post, like what time is the Super Bowl, you know? Like no one would do that anymore because there's so many ways you can answer that question besides looking at a website. But I do think that like explainers are a type of service journalism because they just like answer a straightforward question that someone might have. And that is pretty high on the list of what AI can do. I do think like good writing still has a place here. You know, I was looking at the R naught story, like I said. This is the first paragraph that we of the story we published. I think it, did a good job. It right in the first sentence, it says what it's about, this seemingly simple number. And then the second sentence, it tells you what it is. And by the end of the paragraph, it tells you what the problem is, which is that like R0 is hard to calculate and tricky to interpret. So you can read this one paragraph and it's like pretty quickly giving you the whole story. I asked Claude to write the same story in the style of The Atlantic, and this is what it came up with very quickly, more quickly than Ed Yong, who's a very quick writer. But, I think like it's not quite doing the work as efficiently. Like you don't get this question of like the single number until like halfway through this passage. There's like a whole paragraph before it even really tells you what the story is about. And in this whole section, it doesn't even get to that like clear problem. I think this actually cut off, but there was like a line break, and then it was like R0 is deceptively simple. So my opinion, which is obviously a biased opinion, is that I think Ed's probably not wasting quite as much as your time as Claude is here. Ed's a really good writer. It's hard to compete. But I don't know. The other thing I was thinking about was that I asked it to write in the style of The Atlantic, and maybe if I had asked it to write in the style of Ed Yong, I would have gotten like a slightly better result. I didn't do that. I thought Ed might not like it. But I do think that there is ways in which the type of work that I do, AI can do pretty well, some of it. But if we go back to this chart from the Reuters Institute, you can see the thing that publishers do think is going to continue to be really valuable is contextual analysis, that like explanation, the framing work. And that's a lot of the types of stories that I was talking about today. It's writing that does more than just tell people what's out there, but it helps them understand what they should think about, why they should care about it. And I think that really is core to good science writing, but that's also just good writing. So that is basically my job. Thank you for listening. Thank you.